Hello and welcome to Read Red. Today I want to share some thoughts on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I've finally done it. I've finally read a Jane Austen novel, despite, I think, with the exception of Mansfield Park, owning all of her major novels. So if you've seen my bookshelf tour video of 2022, I did go over my bookshelf, but I also talked about my TBR for 2003. And of course it's changed a little bit, but one of the things is that Pride and Prejudice was bought for me as a Christmas present, I think in 2021, and so all of 2022 it sat on my bookshelf, and basically half of this year it's also sat on my bookshelf. And kept saying like, oh, I'll get around to do it, I'll get around to reading it. I've watched the movie, the Keira Knightley movie, twice now, and I love it so much that I was like, alright, it's finally time. I just need to read Pride and Prejudice because I was really curious. Like, I found the movie really charming and I liked it a lot, but I was really curious to see whether my interest would be sustained over a novel because, a movie's like 2 hours, and a novel, of course, this is kind of like 370 pages. And so the big question that was on the top of my mind was just, how is Austen going to make me care about these characters? Because I don't read a lot of romance, almost none in fact, and I almost certainly don't read any Regency era novels. So I knew that there was a bit of a kind of handicap or a give because I had already seen the movie, I already knew the plot. And so at least that was able to sustain me. But I was really curious, like what the moment-to-moment reading would be like, if it would be sort of boring. And I am pleased to inform that no, it's not. It's like the opposite of boring. What this video is going to be, this is the romance novel, right? So it's not like I'm bringing any new scholarly work to this, and really all I want this video to be is just me fangirling over this book. I'm going to go through, I'll read some extracts and talk about comparisons to the movie and whatnot, but all I want to say really is just that I found this book immensely bingeable. The moment-to-moment reading of the prose was just a pure delight. I find that was just the number one adjective, or really two adjectives, is just that Austen's writing is delightful and charming, and that really helped to just make me, like, suck me so much into the world. And really it's just like, when I read books, usually I want to read about like the struggles of people, and usually coming from like the working class or lower echelons of society. And so I was just like, how am I going to even care about, oh, he said, she said, blah, 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 going on forever until the end when, they get married. But yeah, the good thing is that Austen is such a great writer that you will just be absolutely sucked in. And I think, funnily enough, a lot of books I love and a lot of books I binge, I think this Pride and Prejudice is probably the only book where I seriously actually was like, I don't think I want this to end yet. And of course, I went through and read it, but I was just like, yeah, this could really keep going. I am curious to go and read Emma because I am curious to see how I would feel about a story in which I didn't already know the ending, and to see if if it will be equally as interesting, or if I'd be equally as motivated to go on and read. But from here, I'm just going to jump through. I'm going to start reading some extracts, talk about some things. I'll talk about changes with the movie as they become relevant, but yeah. So of course in chapter 1 we have the famous opening line, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." But what I wanted to highlight instead actually is that there are times when it's not entirely clear, or it's not entirely referenced, that there are satirical elements in this book. And the area in which I noticed that most clearly, I think, is in the parents, in Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. And so, just to give some ideas, I think that they did a really great job with portraying them in the movie, although Mr. Bennet had a little bit more depth in the book, and was maybe a bit more like a really little bit more strict. But compared to what fathers would normally have been like then, I imagine Mr. Bennet is like really just laid back and chill, and it's all on Mrs. Bennet, who is like, I've got 5 daughters, the number one thing is getting them is getting them married, and there are some just absurd comments that she makes, which I really, really love, that are so that are just so great. But I'll read a quick little interaction between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet to give you an idea of what the dialogue interactions can be like. They're very organic, but like kind of hyper organic, you know. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. And I want to read this sentence. This is sort of just talking about Mr. Bingley and Jane, Elizabeth's older sister. They're kind of, you know, they're expressing interest for each other. But I want to just read this when... to give you an example of what a typical Austen sentence is like, and just how delightfully she composes a phrase. So, it was generally evident whenever they met that he did admire her, and to her it was equally evident that Jane was yielding to the preference which she had begun to entertain for him from the first, and was in a way to be very much in love. But she considered with pleasure that it was not likely to be discovered by the world in general, since Jane, united with great strength of feeling, and composure of temper, and a uniform cheerfulness of manner, which would guard her from the suspicious of the impertinent. She mentioned this to her friend, Miss Lucas. And I think that this is a fun interaction between, this is an area where Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth are all kind of hanging around talking, and they're having a little bit of a subtle, playful interaction, but trying to create a distance where Mr. Darcy is saying that he doesn't like coming out to the country because it's kind of pretty boring compared to the city, but they're making the argument that in the country stays the same, but the people change. I did not know before, continued Bingley immediately, that you were a studier of character. It must be an amusing study. Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society. But people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. So this is a fun interaction between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. There have been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love, says Elizabeth. I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love, said Darcy, a reference to Shakespeare. Of a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already, but if it be only a slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away. One thing, while it's on the top of my head, I know this is probably controversial. I love how the movie portrays Mr. Collins. So, of course, we've got the three big love interests in the book for Elizabeth. We've got the most correct one that she should choose, which is Mr. Collins. It's like a family member, it's a cousin, and and in marrying him, she ensures that her family is still able to live at the estate, and Mrs. Bennet is like, you should definitely do it, but Mr. Bennet is like, oh, no. And so we've got, the most proper marriage. We've got Mr. Wickham, which is like just abandon all sort of propriety and just follow the most passionate love, and that doesn't work for Elizabeth either. Of course, Lydia goes on to marry Mr. Wickham, but then we've got Mr. Darcy. We've got the Goldilocks Goldilocks zone in the middle. But I really, really love actually how the movie portrays Mr. Collins. Just the kind of smaller, almost more Weasley personality. I think that they had a lot of fun with Mr. Collins' character, and he is kind of fun in this book as well, but I definitely found that I actually enjoyed his on-screen representation instead. Realizing the tropes in which she's working and kind of making some really fun meta conversations almost. This is a big thing in the movie as well. This is probably the occasion in the movie that made me really like it. So it's when Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are dancing, and Elizabeth is talking, they're having a conversation about how conversations ought to go, and it's basically exactly the same in the book. It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some kind of remark on the size of the room, or the number of couples. He smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. Very well, that reply will do for the present. Perhaps by and by I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we may be silent. Do you talk by rule, then, while you are dancing? Sometimes. One must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together, and yet for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged as that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible. Are you consulting your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine? Both, replied Elizabeth archly, for I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak, unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, and be handed down to posterity with all the eclat of a proverb. This is no striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure. How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it a faithful portrait, undoubtedly. I must not decide on my own performance. And yeah, just these are the sort of things that you will absolutely lap up, even if you are not a romance reader. Like, I really can't stress that. With the exception of some kind of hilariously janky sentences, Austen, even in like the really, really long, like, you know, full paragraph single sentences, she's got such a precision in the way that she syntactically structures everything that you'll just adore it. I believe. And this is what I loved. So this is again, I really do like the movie representation of Mr. Collins, but when he's going on his whole rant basically proposing to Elizabeth, and then he has this whole thing, he's talking about Lady Catherine de Bourgh, he's talking about all of the benefits of marrying him, and then he says, "And now nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection." One of the things that I also found really funny, this is jumping later into the book, this is when Mr. Darcy first expresses his love for Elizabeth, and one thing I feel slightly scammed, I really love in the movie how he says it, "I love you most ardently," but in the book he just says, "I want to express my most ardent love for you." And yeah, I really love how it is in the movie. I love that there's this whole scene where they're in the rain, they're having this back and forth. Mr. Darcy goes on to talk about he criticizes some of the things that Mr. Wickham does, talks a little bit about that, talks almost like insults Jane's family as well for impropriety, which he does in the book as well. But I thought it was very funny where there's like the scene in the book where he goes out, just expresses his love for her. She says no. He kind of sheepishly goes away. He writes like this gigantic letter, and then in the morning he just runs up, hands it to her, and leaves. And I thought it was kind of funny. It was just like, it wouldn't make sense. Like, I get how they changed it for the film to be a little bit more fast-paced, but also like, she's just gazing out of a window, and he just comes in and leaves a note, and he says a few lines, and then he leaves, and it's all very dramatic and very film or stagey. But I had this image in my head of like her just out the next morning, and Mr. Darcy just scurrying along and like two hands holding a note to her, and then just like leaving for half the book. And yeah, I think honestly, without just jumping into spoilers, that's all I really wanted to talk about with Pride and Prejudice. It is a really, really fun book, and I strongly recommend reading it. I do like how they spent... The biggest thing that I like from the book is that the period of fixing up Lydia and Wickham's sort of botched marriage is a lot longer in the book, and it's quite fortunately more fleshed out. But anyway, let me know what your favorite Austen novel is, and thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.